One of the reactors at Fukushima saw a nuclear meltdown due to lack of coolant, as confirmed by the latest International Atomic Energy Agency investigation into the disaster in Japan on March 11. 2 more reactors may have melted down, but instrument problems mean they don't know for sure. The 12-nation fact-finding team has just completed its preliminary report, which will be delivered to the Ministerial Conference on Nuclear Safety in Vienna at the end of June.
Provisional analysis shows that fuel pellets fell to the bottom of reactor pressure vessel at a relatively early stage in the accident.
Last week, there was this enormous bombshell dropped by the government. They finally admitted there was 100% core melt in Unit 1, possibly in Units 2 and 3. All these reassuring, soothing words mean nothing. 100% core melt. What stopped the reactor accident at time was the sudden influx of seawater. If they didn't put that seawater in at the right moment, we would have lost northern Japan. That's how close we came to a national, worldwide tragedy.
Okay, I just want to make sure people understand. 100% core melt means what?
It means that the core uranium, which is 100 tons, measuring about 12 feet tall, is now basically a bowl of granola. Granola with cream on it. That's what it looks like.
Wait, explain this to me. It melted down into this mess.
It melted down and crumbled into this mess. There's nothing recognizable in the core. If you were to take a TV camera down there and photograph it, it's like a pile of splintered granola with cream. That's what it looks like.
And so that whole time when some people were saying we have a meltdown and the government was saying no meltdown, it was a meltdown.
It was a meltdown. 100% core melt. And what prevented the reactor from simply going out of control and exploding was the fact that they dumped seawater into the cores, stopping the accident. And this is not in any textbook. No textbook says, as a last-ditch measure, dump seawater to stop 3 simultaneous meltdowns.
Okay, so it stopped the meltdown because the water simply absorbed the heat and dissipated it. But the downside risk was the seawater then went back into the ocean and dissipated, and the radioactivity was spread around.
The problem is you have all this salt, you have all this radioactive water, and the Chinese and the Koreans have protested because of the fact that they were dumping radioactive seawater into the ocean. Radioactive levels began to soar. People were concerned about plant life, about seafood. It created a huge mess, and it's still going on. Realize that school children right now are going to be exposed to 20 times the level that an atomic worker is going to be exposed. This is so bad that one of the advisors of the Prime Minister quit. He quit in protest and said that I'm not going to let my children be exposed to 20 times the radiation of what an atomic worker would
Okay, I want to go back. What would have happened if the seawater had not gone in?
Then you would have had a breach of containment. That is, all this melted uranium would have plunged onto the floor, probably caused a steam explosion, a hydrogen gas explosion, blew the lid off the whole thing, and then you would have had Chernobyl. 3 simultaneous Chernobyls, raging cores with maybe 25% of the core vaporized and turning into dust particles, and basically wiping out northern Japan as an area that can be habited.
Now, some people have said that what also helped preserve this was that the containment vessel itself was not breached in any significant way.
Now we realize that there's partial breachment of 1, maybe 2 containment vessels. In other words, radiation is still coming out. And we have this mystery. Where is the radiation coming from? It's coming from a breach of containment. It's leaking through cracks in the containment and melted holes. We now know there was a breach of containment. It did not create a steam explosion, thank God, because they put seawater in time. But radiation, the molten uranium, leaked out.
When the giant earthquake and the giant tsunami hit Japan, you were fortunate enough, let's say, to live in a place that was not totally destroyed. But the nuclear plant in your part of Japan was destroyed. And now you and your family have to decide about how and where you go on living. This week, Japan said the amount of radiation that leaked out of the Fukushima reactors in the first few days of the disaster was about double what they'd said it was at the time. Japan also just admitted within the last couple of weeks that 3 of the 4 damaged reactors really did have nuclear meltdowns. Today, Japan said those reactors may have even had melt-throughs. The nuclear fuel melted down, and then it melted through the thing that was holding it. It melted onto the floor of the reactor building. That's sort of steps A, B, and C on the way to the China Syndrome. Remember that awesome Jane Fonda movie from like 1979? The China Syndrome is where the nuclear fuel melts down to the ground, hotter than Hades, and then it just keeps melting down through the earth to God knows where. Now Japan admits it may have suffered a melt-through in 3 reactors. Very scary. Japan had not admitted any of that before. So if you are a family from Fukushima, from where these reactors are, what do you do now? After the disaster, Japan's government revised safety guidelines to say Fukushima kids could now be exposed at school to 20 times as much radiation as what had been considered okay before the disaster. The New York Times reports that parents in Japan said no way to that, so the government promised to tighten up the standards some and to clean up contaminated topsoil at schools. There's no guidelines anywhere in the world for how to handle this. It's not just Japan. If this happened in the U.S. or anywhere else in the world, no one would know whether to let people keep living there, how big an area to evacuate, what levels are safe for kids at school or for old people or for women who are pregnant. We've got some guidelines based on nuclear bomb explosions, but for this, no one knows. Fukushima, for example, seems to have dumped most of its radiation into the sea and into the ground. Chernobyl shot its radiation into the atmosphere. What's the difference in the effect on humans and other living things? Dunno, frankly. Really, don't know.
Arnie Gunderson with us now live. Arnie, you were with us very early and throughout this crisis, and you long argued it was worse than they were telling us. What do you make of this news now? How could they have not known?
Well, I'm not surprised. You know, they're saying now, these are all calculations. All of the instruments were blown to smithereens, so they're calculating what these exposures were. How could they not know? I think there was some confusion, and there's some cultural issues, too, with the Japanese. But the biggest problem is this combination of being a regulator and a promoter of nuclear power. There's a revolving chairs situation in the Japanese structure where executives go to work for the regulator and the regulator goes to work for Tokyo Electric. And that makes it hard to really see how serious the accident is while you're in it.
And as we try to judge the fallout, not only in Japan, and we'll see what that government report says, but we talked about some radiation, relatively low amounts, very low amounts, making its way across the Pacific. You've seen evidence of what's called hot particles showing up on the U.S. West Coast, in Seattle, for example. What are we talking about, and how worried should people be?
Well, the radiation is initially comes out as a big cloud of gases, and that's what you can measure with a Geiger counter. But now what we're finding are these things called hot particles, and in the industry we call them fuel fleas because they're incredibly small. They're smaller than the thickness of your hair. In Tokyo in April, measurements indicate that there's about 10 hot particles per day in what a normal person would breathe. And it's interesting because in Seattle, it didn't go down that much. It was about 5 hot particles a day. Because most of the time, as we talked about back in April, the wind was blowing toward the West Coast. You know, that's why we were warning to wash your lettuce and things like that. Now, what that means is that these hot particles can lodge in your lung or in your digestive tract or your bone and over time cause a cancer. But they're way too small to be picked up on a large radiation detector.
And so, do you believe there are enough of them that people in the West Coast of the United States need to be worried, or is it a very minor concern? Well, the average person breathes in about 10 cubic meters a day. And the filters out there for April show that they were breathing in per day about 5 particles. Now, these are charged, which is why we call them fuel fleas, too, and they latch on to lung tissue. You know, I'm still advising my friends to wash all of your vegetables to make sure you can get it off. But short of that, we're at a point now where you just can't run from the particles that are still in the air. We'll keep watching that. I want to show our viewers some satellite images that we have a then and now. Satellite images of the Fukushima nuclear plant on March 14th, compared to May 25th. When you look at this, 3 months since, do you get the sense, looking at the new photos, number one, first and foremost, that things appear to be under control right now? No, the units are still leaking. The difference in the picture, though, is it was cold in March, so you could see steam, sort of like breathing on a cold day. Now it's hot, so you don't see the steam coming out of the plant, but they're still emitting radioactive gases and an enormous amount of radioactive liquid. So the only thing that's going to make this go away is time. They're going to need another year or so before this radioactive material
cools down to the point where it doesn't boil anymore. And until it stops boiling, you're going to be cranking out steam and you're going to be cranking out radioactive liquid.
The Japanese government says it will quickly decide on whether to evacuate more people from areas around the Fukushima plant where radiation levels exceeding the national limit have been found.
We want to act on the cautious side in protecting the health of the residents.
Cumulative exposure levels in parts of Date and Minamisoma cities exceed the 20 millisieverts per year limit set by the government. The areas are outside the current evacuation zone. Fukuyama met with the Minamisoma mayor at the Prime Minister's office on Thursday to discuss the situation.
Residents are worried about the situation. Some even expect to evacuate. I have asked the government to consider their wishes.